Now, it's recently come to my attention that I've once again become a jaded boomer asshole about video games. And this is no surprise to me, it's happened several times before, as I've lived through the death of all of my favorite games of all time. And so I figured if the future looks bleak, it might be time to look towards the past and remind myself why I fell in love with gaming in the first place. And along the way, I'll attempt to answer the question, does the 360 hold up? And so we pick our next game. Kiyo ho ho yo. Ninja Gaiden 2. This is interesting because this is a game I've never played before. What the fuck? Yeah, so this is going to be kind of a special episode because this is the first game of this series that I've never touched once in my life. I'm going in completely blind. I've never played a single Ninja Gaiden. And so I'm hoping this will be a pretty interesting episode because I'm not just answering the question if Ninja Gaiden holds up in general based on a nostalgia of having played the game before, but does it hold up compared to modern games going in having no experience whatsoever? But this was also the most requested game that I've seen in the comments of my videos so far in this series. And so let's get started with my first impressions of Ninja Gaiden, where we start the game as this ninja guy I'm assuming is named Dan. Now the first thing I found to be interesting about this game is just how closely it seems related to Resident Evil 4, despite seemingly have no connection to the Resident Evil series. The enemies of both games are these demonic bodily horror monsters. Both games feature a handful of collectible weapons that you can upgrade at a recurring merchant. They both feature gameplay that requires you to utilize crowd control mechanics. They both have ridiculous over-the-top gank scenarios and simplistic puzzles. And both characters have a femme fatale character that follows them around, doing stuff in the background of the game for the benefit of a shady organization. Honestly, Ninja Gaiden kind of feels like the Asian Uno reverse card for Resident Evil 4, where Leon is the American gun-toting version of a main character with ridiculous action backflips and explosive set pieces. Our guy Dan here is the Japanese ninja equivalent of that, being a bombastic, blade-wielding, hack-and-slash martial artist. But at the end of the day, these games aren't related to each other, so I assume it's just kind of a stylistic choice of the time. I think games just kind of looked like this back in like 2008 and shared similar systems and mechanics. Kind of like how when we look back at modern times at some point, we're going to see this as the Souls-like era, where everything had a dodge roll and deflection gameplay, even if they're not necessarily Souls games. And speaking of Souls games, the experience that I have within the Souls franchise really set me up for failure going into Ninja Gaiden. You see, I started on the Warrior difficulty, which is the second of, I believe, 4 difficulties, 2 of which you have to unlock after doing a playthrough of the previous difficulty. And I figured, being a experienced Souls player, that my general reaction time and combat IQ would definitely carry over to a simple hack and slash game. I mean, why wouldn't it? I'm certainly not going to play a game on its easiest difficulty in my first time through, right? I mean, I wouldn't do that on just about any game. Kind of reminds me of a controversy I read in an article about that Kazan Berserker game, where they originally had difficulties that were called easy and normal, but the devs realized that players would rather just quit the game entirely than decrease the difficulty down to easy mode. And so, to combat that stubborn Souls mentality, they simply changed the names of the difficulties from easy and normal to normal and challenging, something along those lines. And while Ninja Gaiden's difficulty options are kind of more abstract, being Acolyte, Warrior, Mentor, and then I believe Master Ninja, something like that, I still did not feel the urge to play on the easiest difficulty. But let me tell you, I wasn't ready for this fucking shit. This game can be unbelievably frustrating to learn, with incredibly punishing mechanics such as enemies who lose their limbs become much more aggressive, attempting to grab onto you and perform explosive kamikaze attacks, and swarms of enemies that will each throw explosive shuriken projectiles at you with a delayed animation staggering explosive that can absolutely bebop you around and stun lock you, preventing you from fighting back. And then there's the boss fights, which each have their own collection of mechanical quirks. And honestly, I found a hard time understanding if I was even taking the right actions to avoid enemy damage. The block mechanic is absolutely not a one-size-fits-all defense mechanic, and oftentimes seems more like a trap waiting for you to fall into it. Blocking for any longer than you absolutely have to will absolutely result in a grab attack slipping into the mix. And in this game, there is no dodge like there is in Souls. Instead, you just point a direction while blocking, which dashes you a bit, but I'm not sure if it gives you iframes, or if it's just meant to be a movement mechanic designed to get you outside of the range of hitboxes. I'm still unsure after having beaten the entire game if that's the case. I swear at times I've been able to dodge through explosive AoEs, implying that there is a limited iframe involved, which is absolutely satisfying to succeed at, but takes an absurd amount of practice to actually do so successfully. The block is also another mechanic that seems kind of wonky, and there is so much trial and error involved in learning what you can and cannot block. And that comes down to enemies' basic movesets, some of which are melees but actually grab you, and some of which are elemental explosion type attacks that burn through your block and deal damage anyway. That being said, a lot further into the game, there's also the explosive armadillo detonation nuke, which is a cinematic and scripted moment after defeating the armadillo monsters, which is only survivable if you block with your sword. Now, I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer here. I get it's a silly, cheesy, over-the-top action moment that a ninja would deflect a nuclear explosion with just their weapon, but it feels so unintuitive and can be an absolute gut punch if you've just fought your way through a difficult boss fight. Honestly, as a whole, the entire game feels very unintuitive, punishing you over and over and over and over again, seemingly for just playing the game at all. I mean, I swear, I spent more time on forums looking up the optimal way to beat certain bosses, or the expected way to beat these bosses, than I did actually playing them. And oftentimes, the true answer to the boss fight had me thinking, really? This is how you're supposed to do it? My playthrough felt a lot like torture porn, where something is difficult just for the sake of difficulty, and purposely obtuse at times. Even the first boss fight in the game, this spider guy, took me a considerable amount of time to beat despite being pretty simplistic, because I was attempting to engage with the boss fight, whereas the answer to the boss fight seemed to kind of just be to stagger him as much as possible by unleashing on him a long combo with a variety of moves. And that's kind of a frustrating thing. A lot of these fights seem like they're very difficult and give you a ton of trouble, just until you happen to get a good RNG on a fight, where you'll basically just stagger them to death without really doing much in the way of strategy. There were several points within my first playthrough here where I had basically beaten a boss down to their last sliver of health, but realized within the footage I had that the gameplay I was playing, I didn't really do much of anything. They kind of just gave me their ass and I pounded it. At which point I would just throw the fight and attempt a more skillful and cinematic attempt in order to have good footage, and at least come to learn the bosses a little bit more than a single attempt's worth. In fact, one of the hardest bosses in this game was the original Genshin fight, which on my first attempt I got to below 75% health by just button mashing, essentially, attacking his openings relentlessly and then kind of just ignoring his moveset and taking the hits. It was only after I attempted to really learn his moveset that I got my ass handed to me, specifically by this spinning mini-hit combo which would break your guard halfway through and then pummel you. And so in total, my first playthrough consisted of a ton of really frustrating moments. Gank scenarios where I'm surrounded by enemies whose limbs I'm chopping off, but I still end up exploding over and over and over again. Larger enemies whose moveset consist of more grab moves, and therefore undermine the value of your block. And spammy, irritating boss fights that can often be beaten with luck and brute force, or hyper-scripted boss fights that only have one true answer. And you know what?
Oh my
Ninja Gaiden is absolutely a get good style of game. Much like DS1, it can be incredibly frustrating your first few attempts through, learning the basic ideas of the game and how the game is going to punish you if you fail certain scenarios. But just like DS1, the more you learn about the game and the more you subvert those frustrations, the game will get exponentially less frustrating and therefore more satisfying. Basically everything in the game has a counter to it, and after learning that counter, you'll be that much more experienced and able to tackle bigger challenges with more ease. The answer to big groups of enemies is to utilize your high movement style attacks, lopping off limbs along the way, and then activating obliteration moves, which will one-shot the dismembered enemies and give you iframes throughout the entire animation. Your Nimpo arts can also be extremely useful in those situations, and I especially liked the Blade Storm one, which would set up a bunch of dismembered enemies for me to pick up iframes along the way by activating their obliteration attacks. The bigger, more grabby style enemies are much more weak to heavy attacks, which can keep them staggered and allow you to pick them off one by one while they're more or less helpless. And every boss fight seems to have a similar weakness like this, either to a specific attack or a specific weapon. This giant skeleton monster is extremely weak to the lunar staff, which hits it many times and can force a stagger, which allows you access to its more critical chest and skull weak points. And Alexei is incredibly weak to the flying sparrow technique, which he's almost never able to block, and the extra movement of which will help you to avoid many of his grab moves. At the end of the day, the game is a lot more like Armored Core than it is Dark Souls. Your enemies will have specific weaknesses that will cut them down significantly easier than if you were to run with some sort of static build that doesn't account for the enemies that you're taking on. And so while I definitely had some ups and downs throughout my playthrough, points where I felt like the game was entirely unfair and frustrating and forced me to look up guides and tips and tricks on the internet, after you've learned those tips and tricks, the game gets considerably easier and has a ton of replayability, which is a good thing because this game has a absolute shitload of reuse throughout its main campaign. There are several mini-boss fights which get reused by simply adding a second version of that enemy, such as the armadillo fight, which in the second half of the game becomes a double armadillo fight. Luckily though, if you've learned what you need to learn about this boss fight, you could tackle it a whole lot easier by applying its weakness, the explosive shurikens, into each of their domes, and then of course blocking the nuclear explosion after the fact. Again, this is kind of a frustrating thing to play for your first playthrough, because I walked into this fight not knowing that it was here, which means I did not have the required explosive shurikens for the sake of an easy fight. However, it was easy enough to just reload a save, backtrack to the previous merchant, buy a shitload of explosive shurikens, and then save and start the fight again. It's kind of like a constant cycle of learning things about your enemies, and then having the experience and knowledge to apply those strategies to the enemy for an easier fight. But let me tell you, mini-bosses are absolutely not the only thing that gets reused in this game. About halfway through the game, you've defeated all of the main bosses, at which point you head into Mount Fuji and into the underworld, where you end up rematching with everything you've fought so far, including another fight with Genshin, a guy whose ass you've already beaten 3 times at that point, a rematch with Alexei, with Wolf, with the King Demon monster, with Millennia, all before you fight the final boss, and then the final boss, and then the final boss, and finally, the final boss. Yeah, this game really starts to drag by the end game. Like, seriously, would 1 drop of blood be enough of a sacrifice to give us an entire demon monster final phase to the final boss fight? Anyway, I am torn because on one hand it does seem pretty lazy to essentially copy and paste half of your game to finish out the second half. And if this was a Souls-style game with a slower pacing to its gameplay, I would probably be a lot more critical about it. But the thing is, these boss fights, while still being somewhat difficult, generally only last less than a minute if they're the standard hack and slash fighting each other style of gameplay. A handful of openings will see you through, and then you move on to the next level. Whereas a difficult Souls fight could last upwards of like 4 or 5 minutes. I recently did a low damage fight with the Scadutree avatar, and it was a 7-minute long fight. And so when taking that into context, that Ninja Gaiden fights take less than a minute. It's really not using the asset to its fullest, and so these enhanced reuses of the bosses are really a lot more justifiable and understandable, and again reinforces the idea that with more experience with the game, you'll end up having less frustration and a more satisfying time refighting these bosses. You already kind of know what you're going to expect. In fact, I first tried the enhanced version of Alexei on my first playthrough because the flying sparrow technique was just so effective on him. It almost felt like I was cheesing him, but that's kind of just the answer to this fight. Anyway, the whole reuse thing I think is just kind of a product of the time. Games in the early 2010s really had to prove themselves with enough content to be a full standalone release because there was no like fixing it in post that we see constantly in modern games. There was no live service model, there was no battle pass to grind through. Games back then had to stand on their own two legs. If people finished your campaigns too fast, they would probably feel unsatisfied with the experience. And so it does make sense that the final bit of this game kind of drags on and copy and pastes a lot of its assets. I would say that Resident Evil 4 feels about the same way. I always forget just how many levels are in that last sequence of the game, and how many interesting set pieces there are. And so, taking all of that into account, does Ninja Gaiden 2 hold up? To that I would say, it absolutely does, but with an asterisk. You see, having never played this game and going in blind, my overall first playthrough was two things. First, it was very frustrating and I had to look up a bunch of information to figure out how to play the game. And second, it really made me want to play the game again. For a couple weeks, I've been pretty invested in this game, and I absolutely feel that ambition inside me to get good at this game. I'll certainly be returning to it at some point when I have more time on my hands. But the big asterisk on whether or not it holds up in total comes down to the fact that it is pretty old, and there are some mechanics that just don't feel as tight as they should be. The camera, for example, is god-awful at times. It does not control well at all, and the press right trigger to center it on yourself is just a bandage on the bullet hole. It doesn't help nearly as much as it needs to. You are almost always being attacked by enemies that are behind you, or doing an obliteration technique, which wants to be very cinematic and show off as you obliterate the enemy and decapitate them. But in doing so, it almost always faces the camera away from the battlefield and towards you so you can see whatever cool katana action is going on. It's certainly appreciated for being cinematic, but at the same time means that you're constantly attempting to flip the camera back to the greater threat that's in front of you. As well as that, there are some significant performance issues, specifically when you leave a bunch of enemies behind without killing them, or within demanding asset areas with a lot of visual effects. To me, what really sets this big asterisk on whether or not this game holds up in stone is the fact that there was a remake that just came out somewhat recently this year. Ninja Gaiden 2 Black seems to be a very faithful yet optimized version of Ninja Gaiden 2, and I can pretty confidently say that when I return to Ninja Gaiden, I'll be playing the remaster. It's just easier, it does look quite good, and the camera seems to be a lot more intuitive. As well as that, I am interested to see what things they changed between the original and the remake. The first level already has many of the enemies replaced with enemies that were further in the game, replacing these ninja guys with these secret agent spec ops style enemies with machine guns. And I'm just gonna say up front, I did not play much of the remake at all so far, so if I'm wrong about that, please let me know. But based on just general vibes, I don't think there's a reason to really go back and play the original outside of nostalgia. Again, I could be absolutely wrong about that because I have the exact opposite stance when it comes to Resident Evil 4. I think the Resident Evil 4 remake is god-awful and just not worth playing whatsoever, because you can just play Resident Evil 4 the original on modern consoles, and it's just better. I made a whole video talking about why I think that is, but in short, I think the ammo economy is better, the gunplay is hands down better, and your limited movement abilities makes the game a lot more suspenseful and dramatic. But another one of the parallels between Ninja Gaiden 2 and Resident Evil 4 and their remakes is that both remakes patch an exploit that allows you to gain an extra resource. In Resident Evil 4, if you were to upgrade your weapon's capacity, you would get a full magazine. making it a risk-reward assessment of whether or not you want to reload your gun when it's empty, or if you want to wait till the next merchant, which could be quite a ways away. This was patched in the remaster, and having an empty magazine just gives you an empty magazine when you upgrade capacity. The parallel of this in Ninja Gaiden 2 is that the items that would increase your health used to fill your health as well, meaning you could save them until you were in a boss fight and use them accordingly as essentially a full heal. The remaster instead makes it so that these are activated the second you pick them up, which again I feel like is kind of a step backwards. Like, I get that it is an exploit, but it is a fun way for players to increase their difficulty by a small amount and then use their items strategically to overcome more challenging scenarios. And so with my limited knowledge of the Ninja Gaiden 2 remake, I would definitely understand if many people prefer the original over the remake. But despite all that, does Ninja Gaiden 2 hold up? Absolutely. If you don't have Games Pass and don't have the remaster, but you do have an Xbox 360 and the Ninja Gaiden 2 disc, it absolutely stands up to modern games. It's really fun, and I'm sure I'll be playing a lot more of it passively in my personal life, because I want to get considerably better at it than I am currently. And I'm quite looking forward to playing Ninja Gaiden 3 and the upcoming Ninja Gaiden 4. And so this is another game down, and another game that I can confidently say holds up. Now, I want to give a special thanks to any of you who commented that I should play Ninja Gaiden 2 in the comment sections of any of my previous videos. This was definitely a solid recommend, and so please keep the recommendations coming. I'm sure there's plenty of Xbox 360 games that I never got the chance to play because I was fucking broke. I was a teenager when a lot of these games were popular. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video. This series really is important to me, and nothing would make me happier than if it were to do well. And so I deeply, humbly hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.